I think sometimes, I do, sometimes I think, but sometimes I think that. Sometimes I think that we all, generally, think that we know enough about Jesus that if Jesus were to appear here right now and say, "Peace to you, I am Jesus," we'd all say, "Nah, you're not Jesus." It could be because they don't look like we think Jesus ought to look, and we have very specific ideas about that, despite the fact that there's no description of Jesus in the Bible, no physical description at all. We have very specific ideas. So, appearance, but also what he might then say. Because we know what Jesus says, we've read the stories. And I have a feeling that we'd all just go, "You're not Jesus." I'm Jesus. Yeah, you're set up now. Now you're going to say, okay, you'll buy that because you're just set up to... The thing is, we read stories, especially in the days after the resurrection, stories which most biblical scholars will tell you we think were added later. We read these stories about Jesus appearing to people, to the disciples, right? Nobody believed he was alive until he showed up in person, right? And so he appears to the disciples in the locked room. He appears to Mary as if he were the gardener. He appears to those guys walking on the road to Emmaus. There's a famous story. And he appears to the disciples who have decided to go back to fishing, right? He appears on the shore. And in every instance, they don't recognize him right away. They don't recognize him until he does something Jesus-y. That's a new word too. I know. I'm trying to get people to use the term Jesus-ing, because Jesus is a verb. I know. And I know I've failed quite dramatically at that over the number of years I've been trying to get that happening. But he does something that they recognize as Jesus would do that. It's Jesus. So, why do we find it so hard to see that somebody is Jesus when they do something Jesus-y? Especially when it's ourselves. Because that's how Jesus is alive, in you and in me. When we do something Jesus-y. Here's the thing, though. That thing that's Jesus-y, that's you-y. Isn't it? We're always talking about how, well, I am anyway, about how Jesus is the divine spirit. Jesus is really in touch with the divine spirit that's in him, and also the very earthly humanness that is Jesus. And that's what Jesus is trying to show us. We come back to God. We can reconnect with God by reconnecting with how that spirit is in us, how God is already in us. So whenever Jesus does something Jesus-y, you can do that too. So it's not really Jesus-y at all. It's you-y. Isn't it? You-y is obviously not a word, but it is now. I'm going to put it with Jesus-ing. But that's just the thing. Is we're expecting the flash of light and the sudden appearance, and we're expecting to see the wounds in his hands, like the disciples were, like in the story Thomas is, right? What we ought to be looking for is all of the things that Jesus did in his life to show us how that Spirit of God is in each of us. And every time you do one of those things, you're Jesus. And the best part of that is, every time you do one of those things, and then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, it turns into the life of Jesus. And we start to actually live Jesus. Not just every now and then do something Jesus-y. We're not really good at that. I think part of the reason we're not really good at that is no matter what we feel about how we might feel after we do something Jesus-y, it's way too easy to not be Jesus. There's a guy, just for any of the kids that are watching, you don't have to look this guy up, but all the adults should look up this guy named Pete Rollins. He's an Irish theologian who does this great bit because he once said the words, "I deny the resurrection." In other words, I deny Easter, the Easter story. And somebody challenged him on saying that, and he went on to say, what I mean by that is, every time I don't take care of the poor or the sick, I'm denying Easter, the resurrection. Every time I act in anger towards somebody, I deny the resurrection. Every time I do something that's not Jesus, I'm denying Jesus. It's just that it's way too easy to do that. It's harder to be Jesus. But you know how you feel when you do something Jesus-y? You know that feeling you get? That's the divine spirit in you finding its way to God suddenly and connecting with that God that's in everything, that's in love. Just imagine if you kept doing the Jesus-y things and how that turned into a life of feeling like that. That would be a life where you have those moments where, you know how often Jesus said, and you do because I've said it so many times, Jesus' favorite words, don't be afraid. Sorry, I wasn't telling you to not be afraid. I was saying Jesus' favorite words were don't be afraid. But that's what we are when we're not doing the Jesus-y stuff. You don't need to be afraid. You just need to be Jesus. Say it with me. I am Jesus.
I am Jesus.
Thank you.